Hi everyone, welcome to Module 2 of the webinar Relationships, the Foundation of Development. I'm Leah Nieswag. Just a quick review about myself. I am a licensed clinical social worker and endorsed in Category 3 in infant and early childhood mental health. And I've worked in the field for the last 10 years in varying roles and capacities as a home visitor, as a mental health consultant for child cares, a therapist and clinician, and also provide reflective supervision and consultation. So welcome to module number 2, the 5 lenses. Today we're going to be focusing on 5 different lenses through which to view behavior. Just a reminder that we talked about in module 1, behavior is communication, right? So what we see a child doing is really a display of how they're feeling internally. And the same is true for a parent. So again, thinking in parallel. So we're going to be focusing on 5 lenses today: development, temperament, attachment, trauma, and culture. We also will be touching on working with parents who may have a trauma history and resilience. A little caveat before we begin today, we will be focusing heavily on trauma. And what we know is that a majority of people have had early childhood or childhood adversities or trauma. And so it's important that when we're viewing this content, if you find that you're having trouble sleeping, or you're not eating well, or you're just your mind is really focused on experiences that you've had or feelings, it's important that you reach out to someone in your community, a mental health professional, to help you process these things. Because what we do know is that a large majority of people have experienced trauma. Thanks to the ACE study by Dr. Vincent Felitti, that's also on our resource list. I would encourage you to check out that and learn more about the ACE study if you don't know. But just the importance of that trauma is something that happens to a lot of people. And so to take care of yourself after viewing this webinar. All right, so let's dive in. I like to think about, when we think about the lenses, as when you go to the ophthalmologist and maybe you're being fitted for glasses or something, and they pulled on that. Maybe I haven't been to the eye doctor in a long time, but when I last went, they pulled down this thing when they're fitting you for glasses or whatnot, and they put in different lenses to see which one is the clearest. And so when we think about working with families and children, thinking about behavior as we're viewing these different lenses to kind of be curious. Is it development? Is it trauma? Is it culture? Is it a combination of all of these? So again, really viewing families and young children as behavior is communication, and remaining curious and open to what this behavior means and what that child or parent needs. So we're going to start with development. So why do we talk about the developmental lens? So again, like we learned in Module 1, the relationships with children that parents have can impact their development, right? So using a developmental lens helps us understand and meet the needs of individual children. And what we know about the process of development helps us to promote children's healthy development and support their parents. So when development starts to go off track, we know the things we need to do: focus on relationship, the meaning of behaviors for parent and child, and to support development to go back in that right trajectory. So thinking about the principles of development, we know that development is cumulative. So each stage builds on the previous stage, right? So you crawl before you walk, you babble and coo before you start using words. That each stage is impacted by the previous stage. So if there was something that happened in that parent-child relationship and then development kind of stalled, that impacts then the development of the next stage. And that all developmental domains are interdependent. So that foundation of relationship, if there's struggles or problems in that foundation, that will show up in other areas or domains of development. And we know in our work that early experiences have special impact, and that early intervention is best. And this is true for varying adaptations of development. So thinking of development as transactional, that's just a fancy word for that development happens within the context of a relationship. So oftentimes I really like to focus on and talk about that the brain really adapts to its relationship and environment. So oftentimes people will say, oh, that child is acting so naughty, or they know what they're doing, right? When really, when we look at a child's behaviors, they're adaptations of what's happening in their environment and in that relationship. So it's really important to think about behaviors as adaptations, because when we think about just behaviors, we often fall into thinking about them as good or bad. And really, what do we know? Say it with me, behaviors communication. So the brain really adapts to the environment to get the child's needs met in the best way possible. So development is basically a series of adaptations to an individual experience. And the child actively participates in creating his or her own environment through a series of adaptations. So an example of this, we think about two babies that were born to a mother who was severely depressed and had difficulties being attuned and sensitive to her baby. So one baby, I'm making this very black and white just for the sake of brevity, but one child, when the parent didn't respond to their crying, just would stop crying, right? Because their adaptation was, no one responds to me or meets my needs, so I am gonna stop putting out the call for a response. So then that child goes to childcare, and you see in the childcare that child is adapting to his or her environment based on its previous learnings. So the childcare providers tell the parent, oh my gosh, what a wonderful baby, he's so low needs. I don't even know he's in the room half the time, right? And so how that can be seen as a positive thing, when really we want to be curious about that, why does that baby require so little attention? What does that mean? And how, if we intervene, that can set that developmental trajectory in a new way. But just using that lens of development and adaptation of what's happening. And then we could have another child who responded to the lack of responsiveness by getting really big and really loud, right? And demanding. Then that child goes to childcare, and the caregivers are totally worn out by this child. And so anytime that child is calm and regulated, they aren't paying attention to that child because they need a break. So again, those adaptations are elicited in other caregiving environments based on their interactions in their main environment and with their caregiver. So that's just an example of how children actively participate in creating their own adaptations to get their needs met based on previous experiences and brain development. So one size doesn't fit all, right? So normal development occurs in a predictable sequence. However, there can be a range of variations in development caused by many different things. Maybe a family recently moved, and so you see the child not really growing in terms of developmental capacities or regressions in development, right? So those things impact development because it's such a kind of precarious time for young children. And not all areas of development occur at the same rate. So you may have a 4-year-old that walks and talks like a 4-year-old. However, under stress, that child may resemble more of a 2-year-old. So to really think about these things when we're looking at a family using a developmental lens. How old is this child? How old does he or she seem in the moment? And what's the meaning of the behavior that I'm seeing? What does this child expect from relationships? So when we're working with families and we see kind of dynamics happening, what's the expectation of the child, how the parent will respond, and what is the parent's expectations as well? So thinking in parallel. Is this child experiencing more stress and emotion than he or she can handle? And what does this parent need from the parent? What does this child need from the parent right now? So instead of thinking, what's wrong with this child, we want to think, what does this child need, or what happened to this child? Same is true for the parent. So now we're going to talk about temperament and goodness of fit, which really plays into development, and it's important to keep in mind when you're working with families. So they've classified temperament in kind of these 3 categories: flexible, easygoing, so you kind of see regular biorhythms, they're quick to adapt to change, approach new situations optimistically, so maybe they're really into novelty, generally in a positive mood. Then we have more the feisty temperament. They're intense, reactive. They maybe don't really have regular patterns of sleep. They may have intense reactions to things, easily frustrated, adapt more slowly in situations. And then we have fearful, more slow to warm. This may be more of a cautious child who needs time to watch before partaking, and responds really negatively to being pushed. So temperament is really something to keep in mind when we're working with families, to think about, is this the behavior that this child displaying, is this due to temperament, right? Is this because they are more slow to warm and learning how to use the potty, which we call toilet learning instead of toilet training, because they're not dogs, right? They're people. So we want to help them learn this new skill. Is this because they're more inhibited to novelty? So to just really keep those in mind. An important thing to think about when we're working with parents and children is to think about that goodness of fit, because each caregiver and parent has their own unique temperament, right? And we want to make sure, it doesn't mean that you have to be the same temperament to get along, but you want to make sure that the adult's expectations and methods of caregiving match that child's personal style and abilities. So again, styles don't need to change, but caregivers need to adjust and alter their methods in order to have more positive supports for the child. So example, if you think about a child who is more slow to warm and the parent is more feisty, and jumps right into things, or maybe they're more easygoing and they just, they love new situations, right? So if that parent views that child's hesitation or observation as negative, that parent may push that child, just jump in there, just get in there, make friends, right? And that can cause the child to be more fearful. So to really help parents wonder and be curious about, oh, what does this mean when he likes to be more watchful of things, and how do I internalize that? What's the message that I send myself about his slow to warm temperament, right? Because if I'm thinking that that's a bad thing, then the way that I respond to him may be to push him because I'm uncomfortable with it, not because it's uncomfortable for him, because it makes me uncomfortable. So really helping parents wonder about that when you're working with them. And also to think about, what is your temperament as a practitioner? So again, we're always thinking in parallel, right? And so if I'm working with a family and I'm more high intensity and they're more slow to warm, the way that I think about how I approach them, or how I suggest interventions or speak with them, I need to make sure that I'm matching them. So that's that process of attunement. And the more that we can attune to parents, the more then they have the experience of attunement, and they can help their children, help to be attuned to their children as well. So it's really about that attunement piece. And, we've all had the experience of feeling attuned with someone. When you feel like, again, someone sees me, someone feels me, someone understands me, and they give me words. So that goodness of fit is really important to keep in mind when working with parents yourselves and helping parents work with their children. So Alicia Lieberman, again, a huge voice and kind of founder of Infant Mental Health, talks about temperament in this way, that the way parents and caregivers respond to a toddler's temperament will help to determine whether the vulnerabilities of that child become magnified and entrenched in his or her sense of self, or whether these difficulties are framed by the more competent aspects of the child and do not become a dominant part of his or her personality. So this is so vital, and this is where we talk about how the type of language we use to describe behavior and describe children. So if I have a child who's more slow to warm and I call them shy, oh, he's so shy, that is such a negative connotation. And the way that that child hears the parent talking about them is kind of this is not a good thing. It's not a good thing to be shy. But if we flip that and say, wow, your son is so observant. He really likes to observe before he jumps into things. That is such a great quality. How much that can flip a script for that outcome of that child and the confidence of that parent. Because being told your child is shy versus being told your child is observant really can change the way you feel about your parenting competencies, right? So another one, gosh, he's such a drama king. Oh my gosh, I can't even handle it, right? Or that he's really passionate. She's so stubborn and feisty. She's really persistent and determined, right? So really thinking about when you're working with families, how do they describe their children? And what does that mean, right? You'll get a sense, is this like a positive thing or like, geez, she's just out of control, right? Or how can we help them frame that child's behavior in a way with language that helps to promote confidence and self-efficacy for the parents and for the children. So really listening for what lies underneath labels. All right, now we're going to move to the attachment lens. So attachment is a biological drive intended to keep species alive. We know that attachment is a process that's activated by the infant in times of stress. So a baby cries, and how does that parent respond? Stop crying, you're being so annoying, or I hear you, or nothing, right? Those interactions shape the foundation and shape attachment. Attachment is the way that a child adapts to his or her family to keep the parent engaged and protective. So this is really, really important to think about, and also to remember that behavior is just communication, and that young children are very good at adapting their styles and how they are to fit their needs. So young children will work very hard to keep their parent thinking of them if they're unsure that their parent sees them. You know, so oftentimes people tell me, oh my gosh, he just wants attention. And it's like, yeah, he does want attention, because that's what young children need, right? And if they're insecure about that, they will work really hard to make sure they are seen. So maybe you have a child who's just constantly like has to get really big in order to get the parents' attention. Then we wonder about that. I wonder why. I wonder what the meaning of that is. What does that child need? You know, maybe he needs to be approached when he's calm and regulated in that attention. So just keeping that in mind. And we know that attachment is based on the pattern of the specific caregiver's responses over time. And also looking at, when they've looked at the adult attachment interview, that a parent's attachment style is largely influenced by their own parent's attachment style. So this is where we look at the multi-generation patterns of relationships in families. And we know that attachment patterns are in place by 1 year of age. So that's really important to know, that whether, and I'm going to dichotomize this again for sake of brevity, we could do a whole webinar on attachment, which maybe we will do in the future. But for now, we think about attachment as being, you know, on one end of the spectrum, insecure, the other secure, and we're all variations in between. But thinking about that pattern is in place by 1 year. So what does that mean? What do we need to encourage parents to do, right? Marking and containing, see me, feel me, understand me, give me words. So attachment is a responsive dance. Serve and return, like we talked about in Module 1. When I'm distressed, are my signals understood and responded to? So this is from the perspective of young children. What kind of responses can I anticipate having, right? So if I'm a toddler and I'm really struggling, and maybe I'm just really tired because I dropped a nap, what is my expectation of how someone responds to me? Do they yell at me and make me feel horrible, or are they patient and listen to me? Will I feel better or worse as a result of the response I get? Which of the many signals I give get attention, and is it the kind of attention that I want, right? So it's really about, it's not attention-seeking behavior, it's attachment-seeking behavior. So when people say, oh, they just want attention, da-da-da, can you tell that annoys me because I'm doing this face? Really what they are seeking is their attachment. They're seeking attachment. So the functions of attachment are to provide a sense of security, emotional and psychological, to help regulate affect and arousal. So that's that physiological and biological that we talked about in Module 1, that the mother, her body helps to regulate breathing and temperature and heart rate of the newborn immediately after birth and then moving on. And the promoting expression of feeling. So how do I share what I'm feeling? How do I know what I'm feeling, right? Those are all the functions of attachment. To serve as a base for exploration that we talked about in Module 1, that secure base, that provides, if I feel secure enough and that my parent will be there for me, then I'm able to learn. Then I'm able to take on higher cognitive processes and to promote a sense of competency and self-efficacy. I can have influence in the world. I have something important to say, right? Because I was important to someone. That's that parallel. That's how attachment works. So again, this is very black and white for the sake of brevity. I know that in the United States, the last time that they studied attachment, they found that about 49% of the population would fall into that insecure attachment categories, which make up anxious attachment, avoidant. And so we really want to keep that in mind when we're working with families. So what does that child feel? What does that parent feel? So secure, I feel safe, I trust that people usually mean well towards me. I can stay regulated even when things are hard, I can stick with it. Because I felt supported, I can manage new challenges. So insecure is I have to be on guard all the time. I have only myself to rely on, I can't trust other people. Because when I was a baby, no one helped me. And so I literally learned how to regulate, or I didn't really learn how to regulate, I adapted on my own. I become dysregulated easily. Challenges are overwhelming. And because I never felt supported, I fear or dislike challenges and new learnings. So when we're working with families and we have a child who's struggling, we want to keep that attachment lens in mind, right? So is this behavior more communicating something with attachment that's happening? And it doesn't mean that you have to be therapists, right? You don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic with a family. And the reality is the relationship is what we need to help support in families if we're going to focus on other areas of development. Relationship, relationship, relationship. And again, that doesn't mean you have to be a therapist, but that means you have to think about what's my relationship like with this family? What's the parent's relationship like with this child? So also really important to keep in mind that attachment is not this sudden magical bond, right? It's not this, oh my gosh, I'm so attached. It's a slow social unfolding that requires the full participation of both parties. So when a child is born, we don't know yet their temperament, or it's a relationship that parents have to participate in. So to remind parents of that each developmental stage is a new opportunity for learning about each other. So if we think about attachment and working with families, we think maybe about, I know in early intervention you have a lot of children that come through your program that were born prematurely. So let's just pause and think about that for a moment, all the different impacts that has on attachment. So we have a baby who's born prematurely. So from the baby's perspective, they're placed in the NICU, so separated from the parent. So we think about, and I guess I'm not necessarily aware of what the NICUs in Boise or Idaho do, but I know that some really work hard to keep a parent's scent near the baby because they know that physiological regulation is important. But there is separation, right? And so to think about how that's playing, because early experiences matter, right? Even very, very young, even more so it matters. Then you think about the medical trauma that this baby is experiencing, right? The procedures that are being done to them. And are those procedures being narrated to them? You're going to get a shot and it's going to hurt. You know, first day they're born. They're going to take blood from your foot right now and it's going to hurt, and I'm here for you, right? So making sure that we encourage parents to speak to their children about what's going to happen next. Because what would that be like if we were incapable of speaking or moving our body? We would want someone to tell us what was going to happen. And so the same is true, doubly true for young children. The separation from the parent, again, those physiological functions, the emotional functions. And then we think about from the parent's perspective, right? The loss of what they had, the loss and grief that they had, what they had anticipated, the worry. So all those things that we want to keep in mind that play into our intervention with families that we need to just hold in mind and remain curious about. How is attachment playing out here? How have they integrated their trauma story, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So here we are. So now we're going to talk about the trauma and stress lens. So before I get into trauma, I just want to again touch on the ACEs study and its importance. So in the 1990s, Dr. Vincent Felitti at Kaiser Permanente in California found a trend in his obesity clinic of people experiencing sexual abuse, some of his clients that he was working with, because they would lose the weight and then they would come back having gained the weight more quickly. And he was really curious about what was happening. And so what he found when he started interviewing them is they had experienced sexual abuse at a young age. And so he wondered how our childhood experiences impact then our behavioral outcomes and our mental health outcomes as adults. And so he partnered up with the CDC and they did a study, 18,000 people who at the time were involved in Kaiser Permanente. So this means that they had a job because that's how they got health insurance. And so the demographics were predominantly Caucasian people that participated in this study, and they looked at different regions of early childhood or adverse childhood experiences. So emotional neglect, physical neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, incarceration of a parent, divorce, death of a parent, and I'm forgetting one, but look on the resource page. Anyways, and so what they found, from this study, they had patients fill it out when they did their regular physical checks, and they found that 2/3 of the people that participated in the study, so 18,000 people, had at least one ACE. And they found that half of the people had 3 or more ACEs. So we know that trauma happens. It happens to everyone, right? And so to really keep that in mind as we move forward, that trauma is not something out here that happens. It's something that happens to a lot of people. And we know that it impacts development. We know that trauma and toxic stress impact bodily sensations and literally the way our bodies communicate and function. That we have trauma triggers, that the memory of trauma in young children is encoded differently. And our work with families when we use that trauma lens is to help rebuild that protective shield. So healing from trauma needs to happen within the context of relationship. One of my old mentors used to say, when relationship's the problem, relationship is the solution. So really thinking about how we can help bring that protective shield back for parents and young children when trauma kind of implodes it. So what do we mean by trauma? So when we say trauma, we are saying that it's an event that is perceived as threatening the life or physical integrity of a child or someone important to that child. It causes an overwhelming sense of terror, helplessness, and horror, and it produces intense physical effects such as pounding heart, rapid breathing, and trembling. And it completely overwhelms the child's available coping strategies. So this is when we're thinking about types of trauma. We can think about acute traumas like a car accident, a dog bite, a medical procedure. All those things have the potential to be traumatic for that child based on the emotional availability of the adult and the adult's capability of seeing or ability of seeing it from the perspective of the child. Like I wonder how the child's viewing this situation. Direct abuse and or neglect, so physical abuse, sexual abuse, deprivation of basic needs is perceived as trauma by young children who are dependent on adults for care. So that emotional neglect is really, they found that it's more detrimental to young children to be emotionally and physically neglected than it is to be physically abused. And that's because of that, the child is so dependent. The child is helpless and dependent upon the parent for care and warmth and safety. Witnessing violence, so this is domestic violence, community violence, separation from important people, a parent going overseas and then maybe deployed, that can be a trauma, a parent being incarcerated. Because again, if we remember from Module 1 and we think about brain development, young children are egocentric, so they think everything is because of them or about them. So when a parent leaves, the message that that child gets is, I am not worthy of love because they left me, right? So it's really important to think about then how does that play out in how that child interacts and their ability to develop. And then we also want to keep in mind historical trauma. When I lived and worked in Minnesota, there was a woman at a conference talking about historical trauma, a Native American woman who talked about in her family, they never hugged or told each other that they loved each other. And she became involved in home visiting and doing early childhood trauma work. And she began to wonder about this pattern. And so she asked her mother. And her mother said, I never said those things or did those things because I was so afraid and waiting for you to be taken and put in the boarding schools that really existed until the 1980s in America. And so you think about that historical trauma of the fear of abandonment and how that plays out in relationships and how those patterns continue unless we have space to wonder about why is this happening, right? Another important note on domestic violence, witnessing domestic violence for young children is completely terrifying and trauma based on, let me go back to this slide here. This first line, events that are perceived as threatening the life or physical integrity of a child or someone important to them. So if they see their mother or father be beat up or shot or yelled at and threatened with physical violence, that is traumatic to the child because the parent is supposed to be the secure base. And when that is threatened, that causes that insecurity and trauma for the child. So when we think about trauma, it's important to think about the stress continuum, right? So in Module 1, we talked about positive stress being something that actually promotes development. So we need to have that stress of growing, like trying to crawl or trying to get my parent to look at something. That's that positive stress that helps propel development. Tolerable stress is something that happens that's not ongoing. So it's like an acute event or maybe a couple weeks of acute events, but then it goes back down to homeostasis. So we think about the biological response of that cortisol and those stress hormones come up, but then they come down. University of Minnesota, Dr. Megan Gunner, she is called the spit doctor because what she does is she studies cortisol in spit. And so in young children and the impact of stress in young children. And so she would swab a baby's mouth before they had shots and then swab after. And she's just done some fascinating research on looking at attachment and the level of cortisol in that child after their shot and correlating that with their attachment category. So children who were more insecurely attached had higher levels of cortisol for extended periods of time. So we now know that how that cortisol lives in our bodies impacts us through the lifetime. Going back to the ACE study, the more we have those chemicals in our body, it alters the way that our genes function. And so we see things, they've correlated with the ACE study. The more ACEs you have, the likelihood of you having COPD or heart disease or cancer, those things go up because cortisol is an inflammatory property in our body. And so it inflames our cells and makes them not able to produce or be healthy enough to promote development. So thinking about the biological aspect of trauma and stress as well. So again, toxic trauma stress is excessive, it's prolonged. So chronic homelessness, domestic violence without intervention, physical abuse, neglect, right? Those are those things that it's a prolonged exposure to all those stress hormones that impacts development. Because when a child is exposed to trauma in that way, their brain is going to develop based on their experiences, right? Adaptations. So they are going to be staying in their low brain, right? Like their emotional regulatory properties. They're going to be here. So that's where you see a child who's constantly in a state of fight, flight, freeze, or caretake, right? So they're the child that cannot sit in circle time because they cannot sit still, because sitting still means scary things, right? I need to be on guard. It's the parent who seems really defensive and angry when you come to their house, right? So really thinking about, what does this behavior mean? Is it trauma? We don't need to figure out the trauma. That's not our job to be the investigator of what's this trauma. We just need to look at what is the meaning of this behavior. So how does the trauma effects impact the current present, impact the present situation. And joining again, that child-parent relationship is the first step to any trauma intervention. So again, relationship. So, like I just talked about a little earlier, the importance of understanding how trauma affects our functioning, that it negatively affects brain development. They did this fascinating study where they looked at people who had completed suicide, and they looked at the size of their amygdalas compared with people who had not. And they found that their amygdalas in the people who had committed suicide was much larger than those who had not. And they, so then they can start to theorize, how does early childhood experiences where your brain, if you're experiencing trauma, your amygdala is getting bigger and bigger, because that's what's being adapted, that's what's being grown in those environments. So to keep that in mind when we're working with families. So again, the body stays activated to accommodate for that fear and perceived danger. That shark music, right? You can take the child out of a domestic violence home and set them in a classroom, but that shark music and that perceived sense of threat is not going to go away. So that's the child, someone runs into them on the playground and they haul off and smack them, right? And not because they're a naughty boy, but because that child is literally in this state of activated stress. And so any threat to him that he feels, he's going to react in a strong, powerful way because he's scared, right? So that's where we got to look at what's the meaning of that behavior for that child. And to know that trauma memories are different. So I can't tell you how many times I've heard young children don't remember, oh, she was sleeping when we got into that huge fight and the police were called, or they're too young to remember. But what we know is that trauma is encoded implicitly, meaning it's not autobiographical necessarily where I can, oh yeah, remember that. It lives in my body. So it impacts how I sleep, how I eat, how I develop, right? So we know that a secure relationship with an adult, with just one person, is the most significant protective factor against trauma, right? So that child just needs one person to help see it from their perspective and see them, feel them, understand them, give them words. And however, though, if parents are highly stressed, then everything the child experiences is affected, right? So if you have a child who was removed from their home, we think about all the traumas of that. Separation from their parent, experience physical violence, emotional abuse or neglect, whatever caused them to be removed. And then maybe you have them in a home of another family member or a foster parent who's really stressed, right? That child is really going to need someone who can be calm and regulated to really understand the meaning of their behaviors. So again, how children respond to trauma really depends on their age and developmental stage, their temperament, the perception of the danger faced, their trauma history. If this is complex trauma, so we think about young children in foster care, removal from their primary caregivers, abuse or neglect that was faced, and now I'm living in a new home and maybe I'm bounced around. So that's complex trauma, and how does that play out? And how can we help if we're looking at things like walking, talking, eating, emotional regulation? That changes how we then provide support for that family. Adversity space following the trauma, so a child who's been removed from foster care, are they placed in a home where then the parent or the foster parent is giving them behavior charts, right? Well, that ain't gonna work, because it's about meeting the emotional need driving the behavior, not dealing with the behavior in terms of like this, if you do X, then you get X. But I can talk more. That could be its own webinar, behavior charts. And the availability of adults who can offer help, reassurance, and protection. So in babies and toddlers, the response to trauma we see, so we know babies can be diagnosed as having depression and PTSD based on the DC 0 to 5 diagnosis. Infants respond with sensory motor disorganization and disruption of biological rhythms, so i.e. sleep and eating. And toddlers and preschoolers who engage in that fight, flight, cling, or caretake mechanism, their response to the perception of danger, it can look like they're very clumsy. So if we have a child who the parent's like, yeah, they're just constantly falling and they feel uncomfortable in their body, so is that sensory, or are we seeing the effects of trauma? Little focused exploration and or hyperactivity. So a child, thinking of module 1, the baby who doesn't really elicit response from caregivers at the daycare, right? So that, or the child that's like super aggressive and constantly melting down and dysregulated. So looking at those two things. Precocious competence. So you see a 4-year-old who kind of acts like a mini parent, and you wonder about that, right? What is the meaning of this? So it isn't about solving it. Yep, check, that's it. It's about remaining curious about what is the meaning of this that I'm seeing, and how does a parent make meaning of this, right? So when we look at trauma, without intervention, what happens is states of being then become traits as that child grows. So then you have perpetual distortions. So you interpret new situations based on your trauma experience. So that may be that people can't be trusted, that people are always trying to get me, that, you know, when I go into this home, the parent is super defensive and really aggressive with me. Well, what does that mean? What's the meaning of that? Emotional reactivity. Fear restricts the availability to be flexible with your emotions, that they come and go. And learning and exploring is really replaced by that motivation to survive. So I'm constantly in that fight or flight because my survival depends on it as a young child. And so desperate solutions. So then you see young children who provoke adult reactions that perpetuate stress and maladaptation. So you think, or I like to say adaptation. You think about a child who was physically abused, and now they're in a foster home, and they're pushing, they're just like constantly pushing because they're wanting to get the reaction that they're afraid of, because they would rather have that reaction, because then they know, oh, this is how it works here. It's terrifying to have someone who's acting in the opposite way because I can't organize that in my brain. So that's why you see young children who they perpetuate the response that they're most afraid of getting, if that makes sense. So you think about, before we get on to Dr. Seth Pollack's impressive study, I think about a family that I worked with where the 3-year-old had witnessed chronic domestic violence, homelessness with the mother, and one day we were at a park, and it was like a sunny spring day, and she's at a park, which is like, for a 3-year-old, a park is like heaven, right? And she's on the top of a slide, and the mom and I are sitting on a bench talking, and I go like this to rub my eye. And she stops from the top of the slide and she screams, Miss Leah, why are you crying? And I'm thinking, I'm not crying. But after I think that, I think, oh, wow, okay. So she's so trained to be vigilant about what is the adult's emotional state, because if the adult is emotionally dysregulated, then that means my safety's at risk. So it's really important to understand that, you know, to look behind the behavior. What does the behavior mean? Because it's just communication. So Dr. Seth Pollack at the University of Wisconsin-Madison did this really fascinating study where he looked at preschool children who had experienced neglect and physical abuse, and he used this grid right here to have them look at different feelings. So they go from happy to fearful, happy to sad, angry to fearful, angry to sad. And what they found is that physically abused children physically abused children often interpreted emotional expressions as angry, and that both groups tended to interpret neutral facial expressions as sad or angry. And neglected children had more difficulty discriminating between emotional expressions and more often interpreted facial expressions as sad. So going back to this one, sorry I jumped around, we typically, general population, start to see the switch in happy to fearful around 50. And what they found with children who had been physically abused or neglected is that they saw the switch at about 70. So they would say the top line looking at this guy, they would say, oh, he's happy. And then at 70, they would say, whoa, he's mad. Because their brain had been so adept at recognizing danger, right? So thinking of the example of the little girl at the park. So thinking about then the importance of taking that information into account when you're working with families, right? So how do the parents interpret my facial expressions? Do they interpret neutralness as that I'm angry with them? So just being really mindful of that. So, thinking about looking at behavior not from a behavioral frame, right? So this is how a behavioral interventionist would look at the behavior. So they just look at the behavior, they consider factors that would influence the behavior, and they shape it through reinforcement or consequences. So sticker chart. You didn't hit today, so you get a sticker, and if you get 5 stickers, then you get to go to the store and pick out something. So there's so many things problematically wrong with that with young children. One, if we think about a toddler, hitting is developmentally typical, right? The way we set boundaries on it is important. But it's a developmentally typical response because they have no capabilities to regulate. And then you think about the ability to think ahead, right? And that young children, that doesn't really start developing that prefrontal cortex till they're in their 20s. So consequences, it's developmentally inappropriate. So thinking if we're using a trauma lens, considering the effects of trauma on behavior and development, thinking about their internal factors. So the trauma triggers, have they been triggered, and are they in a state of fight or flight? And addressing that through integrating the trauma story for that child, supporting foster parents or caregivers in how to use a trauma lens in their parenting, and not think about behavior as communication rather than something to be addressed or solved. So here we have just an example. Let's say Marcus. The behavioral explanation is that Marcus has learned that when he has a huge tantrum, he gets his way. If we think about that from a trauma stress explanation, he's highly dysregulated because of his trauma history. So separations from primary caregivers. If he was in foster care and now his foster parent is leaving to go to work and he has a huge meltdown. Okay, so if we think about the intervention for that, if we're using a trauma lens, we would think about how to help bring his body back into regulation through co-regulation with the caregiver, and how to use language to speak to what's happening. You were so scared when I left. I wonder if you thought I wasn't going to come back. I know that happened before, and I'm going to come back, right? Or you really miss your mom. So if we think about from a behavioral lens, they would probably tell the parent, just ignore it, and they'll go away. You don't want to give him attention, right? But what do we know? They're not attention seeking, they're attachment seeking. So the trauma impact on the parent-child relationship, they may remind each other of the traumatic event. Parent may not recognize when a child's behaviors are caused by reactions to trauma and think they are misbehaving on purpose. So, or you have a parent who says, well, I know she knows better, right? She can tell me we don't hit our sister, but then she does it. And that's because when we think about brain development, again, when a child is under stress, they aren't using their thinking brain, right? They're under stress, and so they're reactive because they don't have enough of that emotional co-regulation yet to internalize it. So again, just like as we as adults, if we're driving in a car and someone pulls in front of us, we're not going to go, and now I'm going to turn the steering wheel 75 degrees and gently press on the brakes, right? We think, oh, well, we are emotional and reactive in that situation. So the same is true for young children. Parent may associate child with the aggressor and experience child as the victimizer. Thus, either this feels helpless to set limits or they discipline very harshly. I worked with a family once where there had been a lot of domestic violence, and the mother had left, and when the child became a toddler, she started hitting, doing very toddler-like things, and that parent would say to me, he's just like his father. And so that parent had not integrated her trauma story. She was viewing her child as her equal and the aggressor, not the parent going, oh, this is developmentally typical, or this is an effect of trauma, and so how can I help my child feel safe? So Working with parents who may have a trauma history. Again, we may not know, we may never know, but we can wonder about what the behavior means because behavior is communication and we want to remain curious. So a history of trauma may make it difficult for a parent to recognize what's safe and unsafe and keep himself or herself and the child away from harm. So I had a parent that I worked with one time who would just let whoever babysit her child. And so we had to really wonder about together why she thought that was okay and what that was like from the perspective of her child and what it was like for her, because that was her experience, that she was often left with whoever. And so helping her understand that story for herself. And it doesn't mean, again, you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. And to always know that when you're out of your scope of practice, like, oh, I can send you to this person to help you understand that. But it's also, we're also, as interventionists and practitioners, we want to support parents in sharing how they feel and being reflective. So it also may make it hard for a parent to stay in control of his or her emotions, especially in stressful situations. It may make it difficult to meet their infant's need for protection and nurturing if a parent is coping with a lifetime of overwhelming stress. So one mom that I worked with had a very difficult time even hearing her child when she was crying. So the parent would, because of her own trauma history, when her child started crying, she would disassociate. And so, meaning she wouldn't be present. She was back in her trauma memory. And we did a lot of work of understanding what happens, what's going on for her when her child cries. So again, just wondering about the behavior. What's the meaning of it? Again, they may have trouble dealing with stress in healthy ways. They may avoid unconsciously recreating the emotional conditions of their past adversity. So this is where you see maybe clients talking about that they never wanted to be like their mom because their dad was so mean to their mom. But then they're in a relationship with a person who is doing the same type of behaviors. And to help them understand that their brain was built based on those relationships. So it's not that they consciously seek that out, it's an unconscious thing and not a fault of someone. May make it hard for them to function or trust other people and to use that reflective functioning. So if a parent has a really hard time understanding what it's like for their child, that may be an indicator of, oh, I wonder if this parent has a trauma history. So again, parents with unresolved fear dating back to infant and early childhood trauma may be unable to help their infant or child modulate fear because they ignore their child's distress in order to avoid re-evoking their own stress. So the parent that I worked with, when her child would start crying, because the child was so hungry, they faced chronic homelessness and violence, this parent would detach when the child cried because she had such painful experiences that she had not integrated yet or had the opportunity to share with someone. All right, so we're going to go now to resiliency. When we talk about trauma, I like to talk about resiliency. Oftentimes people think resiliency, or I hear people say, oh, kids are so resilient. They're so resilient. Wrong. They are adaptable, but resiliency is promoted, or resiliency is built within the context of a relationship. And resiliency is built on attunement, right? So being attuned, oh, you look sad, or wow, you're so excited. Validation of feelings, co-regulation, responsive caregiving. So all those things we talked about in Module 1 in terms of co-regulation, that's how resiliency is built. It's built on predictability. I know how things work here, so I can feel competent. It's built on having control. So you offer a child choices. You make sure that they have appropriate choices to feel that they have some control over what's happening, especially if they've experienced trauma. Social supports, building secure relationships between children and their teachers, promoting parent-child relationships. Do you sense the theme here again? Relationships. That is how resiliency is built. It is not, now we know that children are born with temperament differences, so resiliency may look different in some children, but how resiliency is fostered is based on just having one adult care wildly about that child. All right, we're going to go to our last lens, and that's the cultural lens. So what do we mean by culture? it's important to think about when we're working with families and we're using that lens, is this a culture lens? Could that help explain the behaviors or the relationship that I'm seeing? So it's a shared system of meaning, which includes values, beliefs, and assumptions that are expressed in daily interactions through a group of, or individuals within a group, through a definite pattern of language, behavior, customs, attitudes, and practices. So I like using this graphic when we talk about culture because it can really be a lot of different things, right? It could be that I'm talking about age. I'm talking about gender, religion, food, geography, codes of conduct, right? These are all things that we want to keep in mind when we talk about culture, and we should talk about culture with families. What is your family culture? What traditions do you have? What's important to you? So that you can kind of get a better understanding of how relationships work there. So, and to think about with culture is that a lot of our cultural worldview is not in our conscious mind. It's really subconscious, partly because we are likely to experience our worldview as an undeniable reality, especially if we are middle class European American, which is often considered to be the majority culture in America. So we need to understand the difference between behaviors based on cultural differences and behaviors based on environmental stress. So again, thinking back to that example when I was talking about historical trauma and the Native American woman who shared so beautifully that there wasn't physical affection in their home and they didn't talk about how they cared about each other and why that is. So that's based on historical trauma, right? And so understanding, is that culture, is that trauma, keeping those lenses in mind. So respecting cultural diversity does not always mean agreeing with or supporting every difference. However, it does mean appreciating why a family may believe or act the way it does. And if you're having a hard time with that, thinking about your own understandings and being curious about how I view culture. So the goal of cultural learning is to counter the human tendency that we have to make assumptions about people that are different from ourselves and open up the possibility that beliefs different from one's own can offer legitimate ways to view and deal with life. And thinking about, in the US, we really focus on being independent and being individuals and not really being part of communities. And so we are really one of the few countries that value those things. So if we think about in countries and cultures that value interdependence, young children co-sleep. Where in America, we think, we don't want to do that. They got to learn how to self-soothe, right? That which is not even possible. That can be a whole nother webinar. But thinking about, what is this family's view on, what is their cultural view on relationships and young children? So for example, I worked with a child care where a young child wasn't eating in the 3-year-old room. They would have snack and lunch and the child wouldn't eat. He was new to the center. And after observing and consulting and talking with the parent, they came from a country where the parent would feed the child due to historical trauma of food insecurity, and then it became ingrained in their cultural ways of being and in relationship. And so this, the child care teachers often thought of this child as willful. Oh, he's just doing it for attention. When really, when we took into account the cultural frame, he was fed by his caregiver, and that was a relationship, a loving way of being together. And so he didn't have the experience of eating on his own. And so then helping the parent and the child care teachers to come together to come up with a plan to support him during his time with the child care staff. So just an example of keeping in mind that cultural lens. So again, caregivers have an important role to play in helping children achieve a positive cultural identity. Caregivers must remember that each child has a unique culture, history, and identity. This is really important in terms of foster care as well. So helping foster families or foster parents think about how can I maintain my child's cultural identity, whether, however they define that. And how can I work to promote that and help them stay connected to that? Because oftentimes foster families, they get the book at chapter 6, and we're missing all this backfill. The chapter 1 through 5 we don't necessarily know about. So helping families and people promote their cultural identity. And to remember that not all families and people within a specific culture are alike, right? And these identities need to be fostered and supported. It's also important to keep in mind implicit bias, right? So this refers to our attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So if I'm in a home and I'm finding myself being really judgmental or like, why the heck would they do that? That's ridiculous. So is culture influencing my reaction? You know, thinking about, is this my implicit bias because I just assume this is how people should do this? So am I missing important information? What else do I need to know? So we've reached the end of Module 2. We talked a whole lot, or I did, about development, temperament, attachment, trauma, working with parents who have a trauma history, may or not, resiliency, and cultural lens. Please remember to do your knowledge check, and I look forward to seeing you in Module number 3, where we're going to be talking about reflection within relationships, self-reflection, working with parents and caregivers, and indicators of social emotional concerns and delays. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in Module 3.